There we go. We're on the air. This Hangout on air is live. How you doing, Matt?
Doing good, dude. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for asking. Since you're here, you volunteered to talk about Allstate.
Oh, I did. This is my first Cloud Foundry After Dark, actually.
Well, it's great to have you here.
It's the
It's
Cloud Foundry After Dark Father's Day special.
That's right.
And I just so happened to be stuck in Chicago, and so I thought, hey, why not? What else do I have to do?
That's right.
So I'm
Cloud
excited
Foundry,
about it.
Cloud
And I
Foundry
love
After Dark is
talking with you,
everyone's
Ben,
last
but I
resort.
was thinking that there would maybe be at least one other person here with us.
Give it time. Give it time. I'm hoping that folks who are uh, will show up and start viewing, and then they'll be inspired to join us. And even if not, James Waters has promised to make an appearance. So, in the meantime, how did you end up stuck in Chicago?
We have some stuff going on this week for the leadership staff. We have some leadership staff stuff going on, and then I'm just syncing up with my team. I travel to Chicago quite a bit actually because I'm located in Tempe, and
Yes.
since we don't have a ton of staff built out in Arizona yet, um, I travel quite a lot.
Yeah.
But
So,
you
are
know,
folks excited about Cloud Foundry at your leadership meetup?
I think so. We just committed our first pull request
I
for
saw that.
Goth last
I saw
week.
that. We talked a bunch about that during the week, and we are stoked
So
to bits.
it's the I think it's only the beginning. Like it kind of was a little pull request that had to occur out of necessity, and then all of a sudden within the team it kind of sparked a whole bunch of creativity about, oh, we could build this and commit it back to the community. We could build this and commit it back to the community. And that's kind of what I wanted. And so I'm really excited about some of the ideas the team has been throwing around. So I'm going to like hold those close to the chest in the short term, but hopefully we'll have some stuff to release here in a few weeks that I think will be cool.
Well,
That will be fun.
I
Hopefully we'll
am
get people
really
excited.
excited to see that stuff, and you know, just as you were hoping that's what would happen, that's exactly what we were hoping as well. You get to be the first to
Yeah.
our customer committer, and I think actually that's a great way to start. We are huge fans of yours as well. Um, well, I will tell you that later is after 9 o'clock because that's when we start telling secrets on After Dark. So you can tell us some of what's going on then. Because everyone leaves, I promise. No one will know.
Yeah, no one watches on Monday, right?
No one. This is a known fact. Uh, before we hopped on, we were talking a little bit about storage and a storage conversation we had at Rob Mee's house around CF Summit, and I'm interested because this is an area where there's a lot going on, and I don't think that sort of the best answer has emerged yet. I'd be interested in what you do around managing storage for Cloud Foundry.
Um, wow. So the Cloud Foundry that we have today is deployed on a VBlock. So
Okay.
the storage is managed just like traditional VBlock storage, which is fiber channel over Ethernet with Cisco UCS and then EMC storage on the back end. But I think, the reason I was asking you about it is it seems like there's a better way.
Oh,
It seems like there's a whole bunch of technologies that are kind of emerging with no real open standards around it. Um, and it's going to be interesting to see where that kind of lands. EMC's got Scale, and they've open sourced a part of that. We've got Ceph, of course, coming out of the OpenStack community. So from a distributed perspective, that's really interesting. And then we've got this whole hyper-converged conversation going on with Nutanix and a couple other players. And then, of course, there's kind of the traditional route, which is either like Fiber Channel or iSCSI or NFS on some kind of traditional enterprise IT vendor appliance of some kind, right? I think that's kind of where everything's lining up, is like one of those three things. And so I was kind of interested in the failure modes portion of that conversation, because it doesn't really seem like any of them are particularly great. It seems like you're either like getting a whole lot of complexity, and it might be hard to triage and troubleshoot something that breaks, or you're getting kind of failure modes that might be undesirable.
Yeah. Well, I would find failure modes undesirable in general. That's my
Right.
personal preference. I would add another one to your list, which is interesting to look at, and that's React. In particular, React S2, which is the new version of React CS.
Okay.
You know, highly descriptive names, as you can tell. And it is from Basho. And sorry, I'm bringing up the page now so I can.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the React product. I think that's an interesting point, though, that you bring up, which is, I think what you're starting to hit on is like block and object convergence, because I think they're being treated to some degree as separate things, but maybe not as much, right?
Totally true. You know, S3 and EBS actually are essentially the same thing underneath.
Right. And step two, like Rados is object storage underneath.
See, so it kind of wants to converge, and I think the software is catching up with that. But in terms of the sort of fault tolerance, the resilience to failure that you probably want, I think React is something that you should take a look at, if for no other reason than just to see how a system that's built for that kind of availability is put together.
Sure.
It's pretty dramatically different from what you're going to see in other open source systems, even other Dynamo systems. You know, React itself internally is dramatically different from, say, Cassandra, which has a similar heritage conceptually.
Right. Cool. I'll definitely have to check that out.
Yeah.
I mean, we looked at it at a very superficial level, because there was a whole lot of, I know there's some React, I think there's a Bosch release for React, right?
I think that's right.
And then there's some level of CloudFoundry integration, and we were talking about, well, can we use that solution for some of the stuff in CF that requires object storage?
Yeah.
And at the time, I don't know if we've gotten any further. I think maybe maybe it'll be fixed in 1.5 of the PCF release. I think you can already do it on open source CF, but being able to put in your own S3 compliant storage for the blob store and stuff.
Yeah.
So fun stuff is coming up.
Yeah, it is. I note that tomorrow is, I believe, the beginning of DockerCon.
It is.
What's your feeling on Docker?
I think if I was running a startup with 50 people, I would use it. I don't know. I've had a little bit of trouble like trying to figure out where to spend the time. I mean, that's kind of the challenge of Docker is, I think Andrew Clay Schaefer was talking about, if you provide the right level of governance on Docker, it starts to look a lot like build packs. I'm summarizing, of course. But I think that's very true. And I think if you were to run that in a highly regulated industry that has thousands and thousands of containers, that you end up with something, as he described, that looks very similar to build packs. So for me, I'd rather just have build packs out of the gate and go try to solve other hard problems and not have to deal with that stuff. But I do think it's definitely interesting. I mean, Mesos has obviously gotten a ton of momentum over the last year or two. Docker itself has a ton of momentum. it seems like there's a lot of good collaboration going on in that space in the open source community. I'm just not sure it's there yet on the enterprise side.
Yeah, I've made.
And I think
go ahead.
I think there's a bunch of other challenges around like scaling it, around the networking and like how you scale the networking and the storage, like how do you handle ephemeral storage and stuff like that. You know, I don't know. It's not as mature as some of the other solutions that are out there that seem a little bit better baked.
Well, let me ask you a leading question. Do you really even want to be dealing with your container technology directly? Do you care?
So I don't actually care about the implementation, and that's something that you know, I've told a lot of people is they're like, well, what are we going to do for Docker? And my general response is usually like, I don't really care whether it's Docker or Rocket or something else. What I want is maybe not even a container, but a certain level of efficiency and the ability to segment in certain ways, but drive utilization of compute resources high.
You're talking my language.
So you know, you have to kind of roll it back to the business need instead of the technology solution.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I don't know that I really care. You know, if I have CloudFoundry, this is generally my comment ends up being something along the lines of, if I had CloudFoundry, then why do I need the Docker APIs to interact with the container when you can interact with the platform to do kind of all the same stuff?
That structured platform, man, gets all over everything.
I know. It's not as cool, apparently. Though.
Well, you know, people like new and shiny things, and I understand that. And you know, I can't blame them. I've certainly been guilty of that plenty of times. But you know, like you, I come back to the business need, and you know, I wonder what business has a legitimate concern about this, like the CLI tool for launching a container, right? Versus really focusing on that business problem of, I have to run apps, I have to keep my apps secure, you know, I have to deploy new versions, all that sort of stuff. And you know, as I think you're getting at as well, is like, why do you even want to be in that low level business, right? What business value accrues to you from getting down into those little details? And you know, we talked to a number of folks who, for whatever reason, are very excited about sort of building their own paths, and they rarely talk about it as building their own paths. But I think that there is this myth that people want to believe that, hey, it's some open source, I'll just go run it, and you know, how hard could this be to end up with my own platform, right? And whether it's Docker or it's CloudFoundry, right? Even taking open source CloudFoundry, or it's you know, Netflix open source that we package as Spring Cloud. Like, you take any of those sort of raw open source projects, and even trying to use them on their own, a lot of effort. But to try and use them in concert in a coherent way that doesn't involve you spending an enormous amount of time sort of in the care and feeding of your bespoke paths, man, that's a tough call.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Do you get any of that internally, where people are asking why you would go down the route of paying for CloudFoundry when it's just some open source?
Not so much, I don't think, because I think people realize the value of you know, the CI and the testing and the having this and the support. Coming from an enterprise, I think that's kind of like status quo. I think what would be more likely to happen is if we were to say, well, we're just going to go open source and not worry about any of that stuff. I think people would start to freak out a little bit.
So you have the opposite problem.
Yeah, exactly.
See, this is really interesting, and one of the reasons that I love talking to you and the other folks who work with you is that you come at this from a very pragmatic enterprise perspective, which is you have serious business problems to solve. You're not drowning in money that allows you to sort of be crazy with what you build and build lots of things to do exactly the same work, right?
Right.
There are places like that, and awesome, but most places are not like that. And when you actually sit down and I think work out the cost to build and maintain your own paths based on open source versus working with us, and just getting the paths and then being able to put all of your human resource into those are people, by the way, as opposed to tools, into building things that are valuable to your business. The math works out pretty clearly, I think, in every case. I think people have to sort of fool themselves to think that building it themselves makes sense, or they just want to build it themselves. We see that a lot as well. It's, no amount of math will convince people otherwise.
Yeah. What do you think about the whole dynamic where it seems like the high-scale web companies they all go build it themselves? Is that just like a cultural thing coming out of Silicon Valley, or is that like a legitimate scale problem?
That is a legitimate scale problem. And I've actually written about this before. There a couple articles on GigaOM, RIP. Shout out to GigaOM. And in one of them I talked about the fact that scale breaks everything. So it doesn't matter what you're bringing to the table, there is a scale at which it will break. And if you hit the growth rate of some of these high scale companies, you'll grow faster than those things, and you will quickly break them, and you'll end up in a position where you have to build your own. And it's even taking technologies that seem like they're okay at scale and pushing them to sort of ridiculous scale. They break, and totally different solutions need to be brought in. So YouTube has an interesting layer for dealing with MySQL called Vitess. Facebook has done a lot of work in breaking MySQL and contributing a lot back to make MySQL scale. So you take really any of these tools, even robust tools that people feel like they're, these are solid components, and you push them to a large enough scale and they will just completely fall apart. The other thing is the way that these tools get used at large scale is often very different from the way that they were intended when they were built, or the way that people will often think about them. That one of my examples there that I think really captures it is that if you look at a typical relational database where people want to do lots of things inside the database, they want to have these totally normalized schemas, and these very pretty relationship diagrams between everything, and make sure that they only write any given piece of data once, right? All that sort of stuff. And at scale, a very different thing starts to emerge, where often it'll start being used more like a key value store, or at least pretty dramatic denormalization of the data, so that you're writing it in a bunch of different ways, very specific to how you're going to query it. And that's much more complex than, it's an index and I want to be able to query this thing. And the example that I used in that GigaOM article was actually Twitter's FlockDB, which was essentially an adjacency layer, so that they could sort of ask for neighbors and overlapping sets of neighbors in their whole graph. And presented as a single layer, but underneath there were all these different independent MySQL databases that actually had very little sort of referential components to their data model. It was a super simple data model built specifically to do this one thing. And if you had tried to do all sorts of transactional things within that, I think intuitively you recognize that that doesn't scale, but it's not really until you try and drive it really hard that you see it not scaling. And because every one of these companies is trying to do something at least slightly different, if not radically different, they hit different problems. And so they end up having to write new things themselves. Now, that said, Twitter is a big Mesos user, right? So they didn't want to reinvent that layer. But even within that, I would be willing to bet that they have broken Mesos in various ways and have written code to deal with that. They've written all kinds of code on top of it to work in the specific way that they need for all the rest of their infrastructure. And so you get this combination of scale and history and the problem that you're trying to solve, and you end up in sort of this really tiny space where you're all by yourself. And so you end up having to build it from scratch, right?
Yeah, I was just curious kind of your thoughts on it, because at PayPal, we had, some problems that we solved that seemed very similar to some of the problems that Netflix was solving with the Netflix OSS stuff.
Yep.
And I knew some people at Twitter, and it sounded like maybe they were solving similar problems or similar enough problems. And then you also look at like the CloudFoundry ecosystem itself, and it also solves similar problems. Like one of the key ones is kind of like Netflix Zool, the Go router, and like something that's similar to that. And they're all solved in slightly different ways. I think the interesting part of this conversation is like, is that more of a cultural, like I'm building a piece of software to fit into the cultural dynamic of like how my organization works and how I develop software? Or is it actually like that there is not a thing that exists that will run at this scale? Because it seems to me like the Netflix scale is pretty similar to the Twitter scale, is pretty similar to a PayPal or eBay scale. Like, I'm surprised that there's not more cross collaboration. And it's not to say that there's not, but for the pieces that are kind of considered business critical functions, there's not a ton of cross collaboration in that space.
No, that's a good point. And I think that part of that is that what shows up in public is a trailing indicator, often by many years. So by the time you hear about it, they've of course been using it in production for 3-4 years. So in those situations, it wasn't possible to collaborate. But as the stacks themselves are getting more sophisticated, and folks like Google and Amazon and Facebook are more directly participating in pushing that scale for those open source things, I think you'll see more of that collaboration. Obviously we're big fans of Netflix OSS, and so packaging it so that it's easy for people to actually make use of it is one step, but going even further beyond that and making it easier for people to consume components from Netflix OSS, maybe from other languages or in other contexts that they weren't intended for. I'd love to see that sort of thing start happening. But I think you hit it pretty accurately early on. Culture is always going to be the sort of major controlling factor in how people respond to a problem, right? Do they go and look outside? If they go and look outside, do they decide that, hey, they're smarter than anybody else who's been doing this, right? All those sorts of questions come in. And so there's a lot working against collaboration just based on the cultural question. So TLDR.
Yeah, and it seems like sometimes it's as simple as, what are the existing CI processes I have in place, and what does my code release look like? you know, what does that whole process look like? That drives some specific need as to like how this thing needs to exist, be updated from a configuration perspective, etc.
Oh no, that's exactly right. You know, that what does the rest of your infrastructure look like?
Yeah.
Or what is your legacy? Because everything that you have running right this second is legacy from the perspective of the next thing you want to build. And you know, if there's an awesome piece of open source that you know would totally solve your problem and you love everything about it and you have no compunctions about bringing in outside stuff, but then you discover that you know it would take a year to actually integrate it into the rest of your infrastructure, you may decide that that's actually not so great. You know, and in that situation, it may be that because there's so much effort to integrate external stuff into all of the monitoring and ops and all that lifecycle stuff you're talking about, all the development process, um, it's just not worth it. And you could actually do it faster from scratch. Yeah,
Right.
that absolutely happens.
Right.
But you know, the end result is that you get a lot of like really interesting variations on these ideas, and I love that exploration is going on. I actually think that we would be poorer if we didn't have that exploration. You know, if everyone just immediately started collaborating, I think we'd end up with maybe a little too much myopia and a little bit of committee mentality. I hope to avoid.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but there's something about, there's some inherent laziness that occurs when other people start solving your problems for you.
Also true. Also true. People need to work a little bit.
Yeah.
Just a little.
Should we talk about the Go router? I saw your comments on the capacity and performance publication on the Go router.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, since this is basically a one-on-one time, apparently. Usually
Yeah.
I'm like,
we have 8 people
watching
watching
these on Mondays, and it's like, oh, there's no room, we have to bounce somebody. And instead, it's like the exact opposite. Like,
I think everyone is just too terrified to hang out with me. So kudos to you.
yeah, maybe I think maybe Father's Day is taking people away, so everybody will catch up on Monday. We'll see. Although I know my daughter's in bed right now.
Tell Lars to hurry up. Yeah, Go router. Yeah, I totally forgot that was out in public and people were taking a look at it. Yeah, my you know, my involvement in that started with people talking about some feedback from the good folks at the LDS who had noted that you know Go router wasn't as fast as they expected it to be, and
Right.
digging, you know, it really wasn't as fast as we expected it to be either. And you know, going through some profiles, you know, what jumped out is that you know it was doing HTTP compression on the back end, which could make sense, but you know, generally you're not bandwidth limited when you're sitting in AWS, you know, serving web requests for your enterprise app. But the Go router itself was totally CPU limited based on that, and that also adds a bunch of latency. And so by disabling that, which it's on by default with the Go HTTP client, by disabling that, we actually got pretty huge benefits for performance. But it wasn't just that it went faster; it was actually that it was far more consistent, which is also a huge value. So I don't know if that data was in any of the stuff that you saw, but the 4 CPU Go router, we saw as much as a 60% improvement in the latency. Again, making it much flatter.
Okay. So you were down to then like 40 to 50 milliseconds, roughly, I guess.
It depends. It would have to depend on which percentile. I was only looking at like the 95th. I was not only, but primarily looking at the very high percentiles. So it was still, you know, 100 milliseconds or something at those really high ones, but it had dropped significantly. And at the lower percentiles, even like the median, yeah, it was really low, down below 50. So that was really great to see. And I generally advocate for that more metrics-based approach, for this sort of problem. It's not always what you want to do, but certainly is a pretty common tool. And I think if you look at the TCP router design document, you'll see a lot of comments from you there as well, focusing on quantifying our performance and scale goals. And specifically, since it's being built around HA proxy, measuring for both HA proxy and Nginx things like how rapidly it will reload its configuration, how many new connection requests would be dropped while it was reloading, that sort of stuff. So really trying to quantify every aspect of the critical behavior around these routers, which is really about sort of the life cycle of them and then life cycle of requests going through them. So yeah, totally forgot that. What's your thoughts on Go Router?
I thought 100 milliseconds seemed pretty high for 95th percentile. I also thought it was interesting. So coming from a capacity and performance background, familiar with similar problems. Like we had a web application at one point that was running on really big servers, and we were debating, like, do we virtualize it or not at the time, which is amazing to think that we would have that debate, but at the time we were having that debate. And consultants from a large enterprise IT company that has 3 letters in the name that said that we were insane to even consider virtualization because they were absolutely convinced that there was some performance bottleneck on the hardware based on the response time numbers that they were seeing. And I think that we kind of came to the conclusion through culling through the data that it was more the way the application was doing threading than actual physical hardware limitations. And so we kind of just decided that if we made virtual machines, but we made them small and made a crap load of them, that we might actually get a pretty big performance boost. And so that's actually what ended up happening, is we saw like a 50% reduction in the 95th percentile response time by just deploying tons and tons of VMs and basically outsourcing our threading to VMware instead of trying to do it as much within the application, keeping concurrency really low on each instance, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting problem. It definitely piqued my interest when I saw that thread pop up on the mailing list. I was like diving into the data and looking at it. But
so how did we do? How do we do in your opinion on analyzing that?
Oh, I thought the data was pretty good. You know, I'm a big fan of like Gunther's USL and some of the stuff that he's done in the capacity space. So a lot of his graphs are like number of users versus response time and number of users versus throughput, like number of concurrent transactions, right?
Yeah.
And so I didn't think I got as good of a view into that the single instance I would have liked, but I thought that you could kind of map to there in your head by looking at the spreadsheet. I mean, the spreadsheet that you guys produced was pretty fantastic. It was pretty detailed.
Well, thank you. I didn't actually make that spreadsheet, but I will thank you on behalf of the team.
Yeah.
I think that I would really value if you could put that maybe onto the mailing list.
Sure.
Or at least in writing to us, you know, suggestions for how you'd like to see the data and how you'd go about interpreting it. Because that, you know, like I said, there's no one right way to look at all this data, and I think that by having more different perspectives on it, we're going to come to better answers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the one thing I did think was interesting was, you know, Go is touted as the fastest thing on the planet, and I was just a little bit surprised that the response time was as high as it was, especially considering you're doing no SSL.
Yeah.
Right.
Who thinks it's the fastest thing on the planet? That's the question I would like to know, actually.
All the Java haters.
Well, they have other issues. I'm a huge Java fan. Um, I think that Go has a lot of nice properties, and it's a very nice systems language. I think it is easier to write uh, good Go than it is good C, especially when you start dealing with concurrency and memory management, both of which are critical to actually writing real applications. So um, definitely value there, but it's slower than C. That's just no way around that. But that's the trade-off with all these high-level languages, right? Is that can you write correct code that people can maintain? And the answer with C is that it's much harder. I actually am a huge C fan as well, but the truth is that large C code bases with lots of people in them, of varying skill levels, trying to do things as complicated as what we're dealing with at these large scale distributed systems, man, it's hard. So I think Go is a fine choice, but yeah, it's never going to be the fastest thing on the block.
Depending on the skill of the people that you have contributing into that large code base, you can lose the performance benefit of the language.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's
just bad code, right?
That's totally a great point. Or the rate of defects that get introduced into the system could just overwhelm you with work, right? You can't even keep up with the rate at which you're producing bugs.
Right.
So yeah, at the same time, I am a big Java fan, and if you look at the benchmarks for Zool, in some benchmarks, once the JVM is warmed up, it's competitive with Nginx, weirdly. Again, things like that can be surprising until you actually see them happen and understand a little better what's going on inside the JIT optimizing the code within the JVM as it runs.
It just underlines the point we just made, which is sometimes the quality of the code actually makes much more of a performance impact than or the tricks used. Maybe not even quality, but tricks used to gain speed is more important. I mean, thinking about the problem differently, right?
The total infrastructure matters here too, right? Because what we're saying is that you've got this runtime that it turns out does such amazing amounts of lifting for you that you can sometimes depend on it to sort of make up for any inefficiencies in the language. But I think it also goes back to the previous discussion, which is you really need to measure these things because often the results are a little counterintuitive. Right?
Yeah.
All what you'd expect, right? You would expect, hey, Go is going to be really fast. It wasn't as fast in that particular situation. For Java, people just like, oh, Java is so much code, it's so slow, blah, blah, blah. But then you actually go and benchmark Java, and well-written Java, and I don't mean confusingly written, just, idiomatic good Java. Once the JIT is warmed up, that stuff is fast.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a huge Java fan.
Ancient enterprise secret right there. Java, actually fast.
Yeah. I mean, people use it for high-frequency trading. They wouldn't do that if it wasn't fast.
Yeah. They use Haskell for that too, so I don't know that we can totally trust their opinions on things.
Fair enough.
I love all you Haskell people.
What's next?
What's next? I don't know. Well, we've done our requisite platform bashing, language bashing. I was really hoping that Mr. Waters would show up, but apparently he is going to stand us up this evening.
Yeah, that's kind of messed up. I'm
going
to cry myself to sleep tonight on my hotel pillow.
I know you are, and as am I. Not on your hotel pillow, but I'm Deeply, deeply disappointed. A dagger into my tiny heart from James Waters. All right. Well, I'm giving a shout out here to questions. If folks have questions, send them my way on Twitter. We'll give that a minute, and otherwise, we're gonna wrap this up early. To all you Monday morning folks, you're welcome for cutting it short, because normally we're so long-winded. I know.
Yeah, I know. I feel like they'd be disappointed.
I know if we didn't make it to like 9:30.
Yeah.
Totally not exhausting to go for an hour and a half. But I appreciate you hanging in there with me, and we've gotten pretty far, just the two of us, which is nice. Go team.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm glad that we were able to continue that storage conversation, because
Yeah, that's great. And like I said, you can reach out to me personally, and I'm happy to talk more on that whenever you'd like.
yeah.
I think all the folks are packing it
Well,
in the evening. No one has any.
should we? I know that you're kind of officially in the IoT space. Should we talk about IoT a little bit?
Sure, we can talk about IoT a little bit. I don't know. I feel like, and this is not going to be a surprise, I think, to anyone who's spent much time in the space, is that there's too much under the IoT umbrella, and so you can't really make generalizations about it. And similarly, it means it's hard to make products that are IoT, right? It's generally something very specific. So you've got Weave and HomeKit and AllJoyn for really these consumer scenarios. Those are generally very tightly bound to, hey, you're in your house and you have these appliances and these light bulbs and that sort of stuff, and you want to manage all of these devices interacting. And those systems look pretty dramatically different from what you see when you're trying to do industrial control in a factory, or when you're trying to do connected vehicle work with all the telemetry and experience that you want to provide back to the drivers. So a lot of progress in IoT is really about segmenting things down into something where you can make a generalization, right? So my big focus is actually on connected vehicle, in part because we have a lot of major manufacturers as customers who are asking for our help in that area, but also because it's so clearly defined, and it's also something that I personally can relate to, driving a car or renting a car or renting a truck, right?
Sure.
These are actually things that I have done. So I'm a big fan of connected vehicle stuff, and I'm hoping in the next few months that we'll have more specifics to talk about in that. A lot of what I've been doing has been sort of behind the scenes or under the covers, or whichever way you'd like to think about that. Sort of getting the infrastructure in place in CloudFoundry and in Spring to make it possible to build something recognizable as a platform, right? Because we can't just ship some pieces and say, hey, here's a build your own connected vehicle construction kit. It really needs to be much deeper than that. And so, that's an additional challenge for us, being very centered around this structured platform, that everything that we deliver needs to really deliver on those promises to our customers. So, like I said, in a few months, I think we'll have something good to talk about. Waters claims that he's home. It only took him an hour to walk 5 blocks. So.
Until then, though, people can go check out that IoT presentation from Spring 1. I thought that was pretty cool. Did you?
Oh yeah, that was connected car stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's going to be some huge updates on that the next time people see it. So absolutely, you can consider that a little bit of peeking, a little view into the future.
If anybody gets a chance, you can Google it. I think the video's out there on YouTube somewhere, but it's
let's Google
pretty
that
cool.
one.
Yeah. it's a pretty great prezo, I would say, from Spring One about like some of the IoT stuff that's going on, and it talks about the use of Spring XD and like some of the other cool pieces that are being used to
Yeah.
to
I think
do
I got
really
the one
neat stuff in the
you're
IoT space.
let me drop to Sonia and see if this is the one you thought.
And we have
Is that the one you were thinking?
I'm gonna click the link here. Yes.
There we go.
I'm pretty sure that's it. This is the one with Phil, right? Phil and Derek?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Let me see.
Yeah, where they're actually dry. Oh, spoiler, sorry. But yeah, I thought that prezo was pretty awesome, and you know, we've been spending some time with Phil because he's based out of Chicago, and we too are based out of Chicago. So, you know, that's pretty cool. Now we got Waters on just in time to like spoil secrets.
Yeah, you just for secrets, Waters.
Hey, sorry, my old friend Jerry Chen was throwing a party at pre-DockerCon. I told him I'd go over and hang out with his peeps, network with some people. So
good hair tonight, my man.
I mean, it's kind of light, it's shining down, and the little the vestibule is well illuminated. Thanks.
That's the highlights.
I appreciate you hurrying me on and then giving me the hair critique.
Well, you know, details, man. I just focus on the details.
Yeah, totally. You're a people person.
Yeah, no, don't go too far.
You look like you're on the road, Curry. Where you at?
I'm in Chicago at the wonderful Hilton in Northbrook, next to the Allstate campus.
I was gonna say that. I mean, that might be your house, but it does look like a 1950s style two-queen bed setup.
Yeah, my house definitely doesn't have wallpaper in it. We're not really so into that in Arizona. We're kind of into that's a Midwest thing.
You guys sent us a pull request, and I kind of got a little excited about that. That was pretty hot.
Yeah, we were talking about that earlier. I appreciate you referring to it as hot, but I think, you know, hopefully that's only the beginning. I was telling Ben, you know, we saw that as a necessity because we were trying to build out that Bosch release. But then, like, it kind of got the team brainstorming about, like, what else we could build and open source. So I think we'll have some cool things coming in the next few weeks.
Yeah, it was less around that pull request and more around the idea that you could send more now, like if the gates open, and getting the first one through.
Yeah. Yeah, not just more, but hopefully many, many more. So I think we're totally stoked about it, and I think it speaks to the power of the community and having that community integrated into the product. It just kind of makes it, everyone benefits.
Yeah, some people get excited about maybe 5 vendors in a community all like putting their stuff in there, but I'd rather have 10 or 20 Fortune 500s that are using it, putting their stuff back. To me, that's sort of where this needs to go.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think after seeing the CF Summit, the Kroger Prezo, which was awesome, so props to those guys.
Yeah.
Made me realize that we're actually, not only are we trying to solve many similar problems, but we've actually thought about them in very much the exact same way, and even to the degree that we've thought about solving them the same way. So the degree that we can kind of drive that collaborative atmosphere and kind of take each other's stuff and collaborate on it and build something better, I think, you know, everybody's going to win in the end.
Yeah, that's huge. That's great. I think that's the kind of community we've been trying to set up. So I think we'll keep counting on people like you to increase the heat there and keep going.
Yeah, man. I love open source, so you know, and seeing what people think about it.
So Matt, we're coming up on the magic 9 o'clock hour when we drop some secrets. So
Nice.
I want you to think of one of those cool ideas that you'll talk a little bit about, just one of them, because I think you just got done, just bunches of them. So one that you think is cool.
So the one I think that's cool, that's really useful, is and we haven't really fleshed out exactly how this is going to work yet, although I think we're making rapid progress, is we talked about building something that actually pulls user account data out of the UAA to send maintenance notifications. So, being able to automatically send maintenance notifications to all of your users that, hey, we're going to...
Oh, no, we lost you for a second there, man.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Did you guys get that?
Well, you said that you pulled the user data out of UAA so you could notify the users of
like maintenance activity.
Uh-huh.
So, it could be an upgrade of a tile, it could be a security patch, kind of like what you guys do with Pivotal Web Services. You have those cool maintenance notifications that go out when people need to do stuff. So we've been talking about doing something similar.
Well, I think that would be awesome. And is this the sort of thing where it sort of picks who's relevant based on what's running on a given machine, or you just fire hose it out to everybody?
I think to start, we'll probably fire hose it out to everybody with the intention of making it more sophisticated over time.
Well, I think that sounds awesome. I will say again, for the nth time, so excited that you folks are contributing code and really getting excited about participating in this community. It can sound like lip service when we've been talking about it before, but it's been sincere the entire time, and it's just taken a while to get there. As I'm sure you know better than anyone, the enterprise cultural shift required to not just use open source, but to actually contribute to the open source that you're depending on for your business. That's pretty huge change in direction, at least for most places. I don't know about you in particular, but that's certainly been the case for a lot of folks. So it's great to see you guys get over the line there.
Yeah, we just kind of decided that we were going to just do it, and we sent a couple emails about what we were thinking about doing, and we didn't actually get very much resistance. It was a matter of being willing to kind of cover ourselves where we needed covering, and then knowing that we were going to take on some risk that somebody might get a little upset, but the scope of what we were contributing was small enough to where it was a good way to get our feet wet.
Yeah.
And it hopefully wasn't going to upset anybody, because, it was basically a small bug fix for an open issue.
Yeah, it took more than 6 months or so to get through the paperwork. It took GE 6 months. So we have big contributors that send pull requests, but none of them was getting through legal people at their companies. So it was great to see that accelerating.
There's a lot of feedback there.
Oh, sorry.
It's your hair. There we go. Hey, so we did get a question from someone at Pivotal, Rohit Kalapuri, who asked us to comment on Stephen O'Grady's questions after CF Summit. And I know that he meant these as like hard questions, but from my perspective, they end up being awfully easy questions from Stephen. So number one, I'm just going to throw these to you, James, and I want to hear your answers. Is the cloud native label useful or a liability?
The cloud label is very useful. You guys hear me?
Yeah, I mean, you're not speaking English, but we can hear you.
Crap. Let me come back in.
All right. Well, I'm gonna get started while he's gone. Don't tell nobody. So cloud native label is not only useful, but it is a powerful tool because. Oh, James, I already got started. You're too late, man. Show's over. No, go ahead. Let's hear about your cloud native label. Useful or a liability?
I think it's useful. I'm getting echo stuff.
Well, I can mute.
Restart.
All right. Well, I'm going to keep going then. So I think it's actually a powerful tool for us because it is much more than just a label. When you talk about something being cloud native, it implies a bunch about how the system was built, how the system is operated, how the system is monitored, how the life cycle of the applications occurs in the whole development process. There's all of these implications from it, and it's very difficult to escape from them or sort of sweep them under the rug. You have to actually deal directly with them. And from our perspective, when we talk about being cloud native, that's more than just having a thing that manages your containers, right? From our perspective, that's actually about dealing with the entire app lifecycle and providing you tools not just for that app lifecycle, but for building great cloud native apps, meaning they're scalable, they're based on actually decomposed into services, right? All that sort of stuff. And another shout out to Spring Cloud, but that really is what Spring Cloud is about. Is one example of really going deep with one runtime, in this case Java, to deliver a really incredible experience around building and operating microservice or cloud native applications. So on the cloud native label, useful or reliability, I would say neither. It's actually a really powerful advantage, and I'll come back to that at question number 3 here. But question number 2, how will the various CloudFoundry players compete with one another? On that front, I would say pretty similar way to the way that we've been competing so far, which is the structure of CloudFoundry itself is such that the foundation and what it means to be a CloudFoundry PaaS implies such sort of strictness in this core that means that everything is, I don't know what's going on here, but we're going to say goodbye to this guy. Strict in its core, meaning that when something is CloudFoundry, it's not about sort of API compatibility. It really means you're running the same bits to provide the same functionality. But also leaving a lot of opportunity, as you see with PCF and what IBM is doing with Bluemix and some various other folks, that there's still a lot of room to sort of bring proprietary or other innovative systems on top, like Spring Cloud is integrated with CloudFoundry, but it is very much this open source framework and infrastructure for delivering microservice apps. So I think that the answer is the same way that we have been competing with each other, which is by delivering customer value on top of the CloudFoundry platform. And unlike what you might see with some other things labeled platform or a standard, CloudFoundry really means bits as what is the standard thing, and then we innovate on top of those bits, everyone in the ecosystem. And if you forked, you're not CloudFoundry. Moving on. So question number 3, how will the CloudFoundry ecosystem compete with orthogonal projects such as Docker, Kubernetes, Mesos, OpenStack, and so on? The answer is it's not really that competitive. When you look at CloudFoundry, CloudFoundry operates up a level or several levels from all those projects, and this comes back to actually something that we were talking about early on tonight, which is you could certainly take a bunch of open source and build your own PaaS. Some people do that, but when you look at what the actual business value is and what the resource allocation is that makes sense for your business, should you be building and maintaining your own PaaS, or should you just be riding on top of a structured PaaS that solves most of the problems that you have? To me, that choice should be easy, but some folks have different preferences, and so they want to use tools like Docker and Kubernetes and OpenStack to sort of build their own. And I see most of these projects as complementary in most ways. We've talked about adding support for Docker containers because again, what is Docker? It's an API, it's an image format. Like there's, adding support to CloudFoundry is simple because there's just not that much to it. Things like Kubernetes and Mesos, there's some overlap with what goes on in the platform today, but at the same time, you could conceive of running CloudFoundry on top of them, right? That there's so much value up the stack in CloudFoundry for delivering and operating applications that saying, hey, what about this resource scheduler versus that resource scheduler? It's like, we can maybe be flexible there and find opportunities to collaborate, because really the value that we're delivering to customers is much further up the stack, much closer to their applications.
And also down the stack. I mean, Matt used Bosch in a pretty serious way. So there's a couple.
That's totally true. Totally true. I know. Always got to get a shout out for Bosch, but Matt did give shout outs to Bosch earlier, just so you know. He was there ahead of you.
I still have echo, even though I've restarted my entire system 8 times.
It's probably a combination of you and me. Like, here, let me mute.
I'm gonna go mute.
Yeah, see, it's because you're unmuted there. All right. And OpenStack, I'm not even going to bother talking about OpenStack. So what were you going to say, Matt?
I was just going to say, when you mute, we can hear James just fine.
Yeah, that's what I figured is, between the three of us, we've got this this echo thing. So I'm actually gonna mute so that James can get in lots of words edgewise there.
I mean, I think the only one that was really interesting to me of those is the cloud native thing, and I think we have 2 layers for that reason. We've got Bosch, where you can run almost anything any way you want to run it, just in an automated declarative way, and then we have the platform Elastic Runtime layer, where you can run essentially, microservices or cloud native apps, whatever you want to call them, in a very modern way with a little bit lower touch, a little bit more automated lifecycle. So we lead with cloud native because we think that's the easiest thing to do continuous delivery on. And then, of course, for the things you don't want to change every day, traditional VMs and Bosch are a great way to go. I mean, I don't know what you think about that set of trade-offs, Matt. We try to get people to get their app layer modernized, at least, even if we run stateful things in Bosch still.
So what I would say is, I kind of agree with what Ben said earlier, which is there's kind of like certain properties that have to exist for an app to be considered cloud native, and I think the convention is very useful when talking to people within a large organization about, can I just pick up my thing and move it to the platform?
Right.
You can actually start to describe like what a cloud native app starts to look like how do I scale it, how do I release it, how does it interact with its dependencies, how does it map to like 12-factor. You can kind of talk about those things, and you actually have a label to put on it, which I think is pretty useful, because like your giant EJB thing that's 10 million lines of code that runs on WebSphere probably isn't cloud native. And so I think from that perspective, it's really useful in that it kind of helps you drive the conversation and get everybody on the same page and have a reference label that seems to have pretty similar meaning kind of across the board. I think the question about like is it a hindrance or not would kind of, I mean, the only way I can see it getting in the way is if it's too ambiguous, or if people interpret it to mean different things in different contexts. And so far, from what I'm seeing, that doesn't appear to be the case.
Yeah, I think that's the real positive way of saying it, which is it's actually the right movement to be a part of right now, and that's kind of how we think of it. And it's a movement that's bigger than just CloudFoundry in some ways, so it's the right way of articulating where we're heading and the design principle. With the release valve of, some people say like, oh, CloudFoundry doesn't do anything stateful, and then I get a little bit grumpy. I'm like, well, actually, our Bosch data services are pretty good at that. It's just those are there to support cloud native apps, as opposed to being, we essentially don't want you to take your EJB WebSphere thing and jam it in Bosch and be like, hey, we're cloud native now. That's what we're trying to get away from. Walk that line.
And dealing with state is very hard, and so anybody who kind of expresses that as a very easy thing that doesn't take much thought needs to be given a talking to, in my opinion.
That's actually why Vadim said that Bosch was hard to use. He said, well, for the stateful layer, you don't want idiots running it, so I kept it hard to use to keep the idiots out.
I mean, I would be interested in Ben's perspective on this, especially like with the whole dynamic of like, how do you deal with multiple availability zones or domains of failure? Like when you start mapping state against that thing, that's really all that matters at the end of the day. Like your stuff's not going to work if you don't do that right, and it's not like a trivial task. It's very application.
Yeah, and actually you kind of hit on the answer there, and that is as you go into these, this is sort of the hardest part of cloud native, and why, like if you want to get down to a really concrete reason why like your big EJB WebSphere app is not cloud native, it is that to be cloud native, when it comes to storage, you have to actually be aware of your storage being distributed, aware of the consistency and availability guarantees of your storage system, and take those into account in your app. And of course, your different apps will have different responses and different expectations around those. And so one of the big areas that I think cutting edge startups and huge web scale companies have dealt with for a while, but it still hasn't really gotten into a form that is consumable by enterprise folks, meaning it's actually integrated with all the other infrastructure that they use. Because if it's not, it's hard to actually adopt it. Is that notion of exposing the underlying properties of the storage to the applications and giving them a framework within which to manage those properties. So it's much harder than like I have some availability zones I'm shoving bits around, right? The apps really do have to be aware of it, and what that looks like. There are a bunch of different opinions on that, and they show up in like the interface to Cassandra or various other abstractions that people have built. But I don't think it's a solved problem at all. Sort of how you should expose this to your application, and that's again part of the heavy lifting that we want to be able to do is the storage side, and there's a lot of variety of what storage means. The easy stuff like, hey, I want a MySQL database. Obviously, we can do that really easily, and we do that today. But I think the more interesting questions are around, hey, I have a highly distributed, fault-tolerant database. How do I make that available to my applications, and how do I deal with failures as they occur and the recovery process, et cetera? So a lot of open questions, but also a lot of really exciting work to be done, and a lot of exciting platform components, I think, coming on.
While we play the unmute game, don't disagree. Simplest example is our MySQL service. The Galera one means you might have occasional client retries based on the way that the data is distributed. So you might have to make slight modifications to expect a retry in certain lock failure cases, optimistic write failure cases. That's the most trivial example of modifying your app to be aware of the storage. But it goes up from there.
Good question, though. So, hey, James.
Yo.
It's well after 9 o'clock. We need a secret from you.
I used to have all these secrets because there was all this stuff that we had on the doc of major announcements and stuff coming before Summit that I would leak out ahead of time. What's a good secret this week?
DockerCon's tomorrow, and you just came from a VC party. Don't tell me you have no secrets.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Docker and CoreOS bury the hatchet around container standards this week. I wouldn't be surprised. I'll say that.
And when we get to participating in that community that's forming around establishing a single unified standard for containers, who are you sending?
Well, we have this individual that's pretty good at those sorts of engineering-centric architectural tasks named Ben Black, but nothing official. We'll see what happens this week, but it'd be nice to have you involved in things like that if they were to occur.
This is your future, Docker. Think carefully.
Okay, Ben. Come on, Ben.
You're going to scare them away.
No, I actually, I am relieved is the best word for all that noise finally being resolved, because it was not really benefiting customers, not benefiting us, right? To get a lot of noise around, hey, what about this format versus that format and all that sort of stuff. But I think also ultimately bad for Docker and for CoreOS. On the Docker side, I just don't think that they were moving as fast with the definition of that, what a container is and how developers interact with it in the way that CoreOS was. So I'm hoping that this will sort of pull them forward at the same time as resolving that conflict in the minds of customers, so that there's really only one answer, and there really only needs to be one answer, right? There aren't 10 ways to describe containers and networks and capabilities. So I think it's a great thing, and if we can be part of that and bring that value back to our customers, then I'm a happy camper.
Yeah, we'll see what happens this week. And also, McKenty's been in Asia for 2 weeks. He was stirring up a lot of trouble over there, so I'm excited to have him on maybe next week if we can. I'm headed off for 2 weeks to Boston, New York, Atlanta, DC, to see some folks. So it should be fun. We'll see what rocks we turn over the next 2 weeks. I'm sure it'll be interesting.
All right. Well, we got our secrets. We got our questions. We got our customers. I think we had a great CFAD. We're done.
We just got to get Schaefer back on and McKenty back on. They've been slacking, but it's nice to have you at 3 a.m.
People are going to get used to having me here, and then no one's going to watch this thing. So I sent mail to McKenty. Hopefully next week you can cajole him into getting on here, and we had discussed moving it back to 9 o'clock Pacific. So if anyone has any strong feelings either way on 9 o'clock Pacific, please tweet your ire at us. Otherwise, I think we should plan on it being 9 o'clock next week, and then we're more likely to get Schaefer in. Cross your fingers.
Cool. Thanks for coming, Matt.
Hey, thank you, Matt. It was awesome talking to you. Hit me on email, and we will continue that conversation.
Yeah, sure thing. The only last thing I wanted to bring up is we've been working with the folks to help the Arizona CloudFoundry meetup group, and I think the first meetup's going to be in early July. So if anybody's in the Arizona area, or anybody in the Arizona area, definitely be on the lookout for that, because I think an invite will be coming soon.
That is awesome, and no better way to close this out. So thank you, Matt. Thank you, James. Thank you, everybody that's been watching, and see you next week.
Thanks, guys.